Well, hello again, and thank you for joining with me in today's morning devotionals. We've been looking at 1 Timothy chapter 6. We began in verse 3, where Paul was talking about people who are troublemakers, basically. They cause all sorts of controversy. They push ideas that aren't biblical, and then they basically will slander you and attack you if you counter them. And how do we negotiate and deal with those things? And I think one of the things is we need to understand these people more perfectly. And I think he really touches on it in verse 4, where Paul says that these are people who have been robbed of the truth. Now think about that phrase, robbed of the truth. Keep in mind, when Paul wrote things, he didn't just throw words out to kind of cobble together a sentence and make it sound good. He picked specific words that were very descriptive of exactly what was going on and how we needed to understand the dynamic. And people who are robbed of the truth, we have to ask the question, who robbed them of the truth? And Jesus told us exactly who it was. He said Satan has basically plucked the seed of truth out of their heart. He has blinded their eyes. He's deceived them and led them astray. Paul would go on to say that they've been taken captive by Satan to do his will. I think it's so important for us to understand and to view people from that point of view, because otherwise we can become very harsh and resentful towards them, especially when people say evil things about you and are hypercritical and so forth and so on. It's an accusatory. It's really easy to get defensive and begin to feel all sorts of negative things about them. And what happens is that Satan uses their deception to stimulate unhealthy dynamics in your life. He gets you to, first of all, be resentful, and then he gets you to be bitter, and then bitterness leads to maliciousness. Maliciousness is kind of that scheming that we do when we try to think about how can we get even. It's like those imaginations where we're just sitting daydreaming and saying, boy, I just wish I could do X, Y, Z, or I wish this would happen. That's maliciousness. In other words, you're wishing malice on somebody else. And ultimately, the scripture says that malice becomes a root that goes and destroys your entire being. One of the things that Jesus said, that if you hate your brother in your heart, you've already murdered him. What he was saying essentially is that you've already begun to walk down that pathway that, if you continue to do so, eventually will lead you to a murderous response. People who commit homicides are people who are filled with rage and hate. And it manifests itself sometimes against people who are completely innocent. They may have anger at a parent or a sibling or any other person, their boss, but they go out and strike other people with violence because they basically have put that person they hate, the face of that person, on an innocent victim. They strike somebody that they can. Most predators look for soft targets. I mean, they aren't, if they see that they're going to get whacked if they try and do something, they usually, if not most of the time, I'd say only 99.999% of the time, they will move on and look for a softer target, because in their hearts, they're really cowards. But the truth of the matter is that these people are doing that because Satan has robbed them of the truth. He has deceived them. He's filled their mind with lies. And of course, he uses what we talked about the other day, fog, fear, obligation, and guilt, to control their behavior and their choices. And ultimately, they become so filled with bitterness and rage that they just want to damage other people one way or another. As I talked about narcissistic personalities, and that seems to be a growing personality trait in our culture, that they actually find pleasure in your displeasure. Your unhappiness actually is something that makes them happy, and they'll go to endless efforts to win in that conflict. They'll do whatever they can. They'll try to push every button they can find in order to get a response of anger and resentment or hatred, and not knowing that they're basically just the pawns of Satan. Satan is just using them for his purposes to get you and me and everybody else who's trying to walk with God to begin to go down that trail of bitterness, where resentment, bitterness, malice, and anger take control of our lives. And instead of being defined by the love of God, we become defined by the anger towards a person or persons that we think has injured us unfairly. That's why Proverbs Solomon said, injustice drives a good man crazy. And it does. It just drives you out of your mind until you realize that there is justice. Injustice will not always stand. It may not come in your lifetime, but justice is going to come, because at the end, every man is going to have to stand before the God of the universe, the righteous judge who doesn't deal with partiality, can't be persuaded to believe something that's true, who sees through us transparently and knows everything about us. So as a Christian, my obligation is to seek God, and through his word, through prayer, and through fellowship of other believers, through teaching of the word, to allow God to expose any kind of untruthfulness that might be living inside of me, because I don't want it to take me down that road. Spiritual warfare really comes down to getting you to believe a lie. And many times that lie is to believe that you're justified in hating somebody or disliking them intensely. Every person has their story. Every sinner has a journey that led them to where they're at. And our goal is to pray for them and to speak the truth and to do it without compromise, because even though it may create rage on their side, ultimately, eventually, they're going to have to confront the truth, because the truth will always confront them. And that's kind of the confidence we have to have as Jesus followers, that he who is the God of truth, who declared the word of truth, who sends out in the world the Spirit of truth, is the one who has an absolute grasp on what is true, and also an absolute grasp on the consequences of both the acceptance and the rejection of that truth. And if we can begin to think clearly on these kind of things, it's amazing how we'll find that there's a real peace and joy that enters in our life, that we'll stop picking up the dog manure that other people's dogs left on the side of the road. And we'll stop carrying that stink. And that's why sometimes when I hear people who are very angry and vitriolic and stuff, and they begin to just kind of vomit their feelings on you, that it's almost like, I don't want you vomiting on me, because I don't want my clothes to smell like vomit. I don't want my life to have your stink on it. And so that's where we need to just really kind of counsel people. I mean, recently I was talking to somebody who is going through an incredible level of injustice and unfairness. I mean, it's staggering to me how cruel and mean and self-absorbed and how wicked some people can be. And yet, as I'm talking with an individual, what I'm trying to do is saying, but let's step back and let's begin to really focus on the fact that God is still on the throne, God is still in control, and that, as I said earlier in the week, everything that hurts me is designed by God to heal me. And everything that humbles me is designed by God to help me. And so even though this is terrible, it's unfair, and we can go over we cover that ground over and over and over again, which is the tendency that we have, the truth of the matter is that God's absolute truth and reality will win out in the end. And that's why I want to be one who lives in humility before God and in honesty before God, not in somebody who is spending all my days defending my rights and claiming that I've been treated unfairly. We've all been treated unfairly. Life is not fair. And human relationships are often imbalanced and unfair, but so is grace. I remember asking a mentor of mine one time, I said, help me understand the concept of grace and the balance between grace and works. And he said, well, that's your first problem, is you're trying to find a balance where there is no balance. He said, you have to understand that grace is, by its very nature, imbalanced. It's all of God. It's none of you. And I remember that was so helpful for me, because it really, really opened my eyes, where I could see for the first time what it means to live by grace. How successful have I been? I will be the first to admit I have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God more times than even you could count. But the bottom line is, that's where grace comes in. Grace is that thing where I come to this realization, I go, oh, Father, forgive me. I've done it again and again and again. And so these are important concepts. I just probably stop here and let you meditate on this, but this is really the ground where the battles are fought. It's the ground in your own heart and mind. And Satan's effort, his whole effort, is to get a foothold in your life that he can begin to exploit and turn you from a child of grace to a ghoulish individual who's filled with anger, resentment, and bitterness. So, blessings. We'll wrap this up tomorrow as we come to the end of this week's broadcast. And thank you for following along. I appreciate it. Blessings.